This is BBC News, the headlines. The UN has sounded a dire warning that climate change is unfolding more quickly than feared and humanity is almost entirely to blame. It says ongoing emissions could also see a key temperature limit broken in just over a decade. It comes as people are forced to leave their homes in parts of Greece and in California, where wildfires are continuing to burn out of control. The president of Belarus has told the BBC that Britain can choke on the economic sanctions it's imposed on his country in response to human rights abuses. He was speaking at a lengthy press conference 1 year since the disputed presidential election. The Taliban have seized 6 provincial capitals in Afghanistan, including the strategic town of Kunduz. They've dismissed international calls for a ceasefire. Hello and welcome to our look ahead to what the papers will be bringing us tomorrow. With me are Lucy Beresford and also Joe Twyman. Welcome back to both of you. Now, let's take a look at tomorrow's front pages, starting with the Metro, which leads on the UN climate report, which it calls the starkest alert yet over the threat of human-led climate change and a code red for humanity. The Financial Times also leads on the report, which warns the world is likely to be 1.5 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels in just 20 years if drastic action isn't taken. The Eye quotes the climate change expert Lord Stern, who tells the Prime Minister and Chancellor to ramp up British efforts and be more active in effecting change. The Guardian quotes some of the scientists involved in the report who say the global climate crisis is inevitable, unprecedented and irreversible. The Daily Mail also features the story and uses the same picture featured on a number of front pages of a victim of the Greek wildfires. It also covers another story on the cost of COVID PCR tests required for travel abroad and how they've cost up to 5 times as much as some flights. The Telegraph looks forward to tomorrow's A-level results that thousands of teenagers will be receiving. Experts predict the number of A's or A-stars handed out could be higher than last year. The Times reports on the news reported by BBC Panorama about the former Prime Minister David Cameron, who made around £7 million from the failed finance company Greensill. And The Sun features the Tokyo Olympics golden couple, Jason and Laura Kenny, who returned to the UK today with the rest of Team GB after both winning record-breaking cycling golds. So let's begin. Let's start with The Guardian, which has got a photo that's featured on so many of the front pages, an extraordinary Greek tragedy photo, isn't it, taken of a woman in distress as the wildfire nears her home in Greece on the island of Avia. And Lucy, last time we spoke, I think you were making the point that we have this extremely stark, disturbing report about climate change at the same time as so many people around the world are now really directly feeling the effects of climate change.
Yes, and I was also thinking about the fact that it feels so much closer to home. You know, 3.5 million Brits went to Greece in 2019 on holiday. So it's a country that many people in this country are familiar with. Whereas in the past, where we've heard stories about some random atoll in the middle of the Pacific, which may or may not be submerged by seawater in 20 years' time, it all feels so abstract. Whereas I think these photos are really bringing home the actual stark report that has been put out there today, which is really talking about how inevitable it is that the climate is going to get worse, the climate change is here to stay unless we actually do something about it. And therein lies the problem, because we can all do little individual things, and we have the COP26 conference happening in November, which we're hosting in Glasgow, where we're hoping to corral all of the people who are attending to really put policies in place so that climate change doesn't escalate. But we've still got countries around the world who are churning out way more carbon emissions than, say, a country like the UK, which is responsible for 1% of carbon emissions, whereas you've got a country like China, which is responsible for over 25%, it's about 27%. So even though this climate crisis is global, and even though the UN report is trying to marshal the resources of every country on the planet, there is a very big danger that this will be one more report and nothing will happen.
Joe, what do you think about that? Do you think that there is room to ignore such a stark warning?
Well, I think some people will always ignore such warnings and have indeed consistently ignored warnings. We've had Kyoto protocols, we've had the Paris Climate Agreement, we're having COP26, and consistently around about 7 out of 10 people, more than 7 out of 10 people in this country, believe that global warming and climate change are real and that they are caused in the majority by human activity. And yet consistently around about sort of 16% of people do not believe that. They believe that climate change is not happening or that it's not a result of human activity. And the science is very clear on this. 234 scientists contributed to the latest report. The science is very clear on lots of things. I mean, most recently on vaccinations and indeed various things to do with COVID. And yet there are still people who will vehemently, sometimes violently, deny that this is the case. And this is a struggle for government, as indeed is the need to balance all the requirements that are needed in order to bring about to prevent the worst cases, the worst effects of climate change. And the report says that some of the worst effects can be prevented, but it will take not just individuals in this country, it will take companies and organisations and indeed other countries to be on board. This will be a global effort for a global issue.
And it will have to be governments that lead the way for some of the really major decisions. And if I can just go to the front page of the Daily Telegraph, which has exactly the same photo at the top, but it's talking about the UK government and what it might do. Lucy, what's the detail in the story?
Well, calls are really growing, I think, now for ministers in the government to spell out how they're actually going to achieve any goals of being net zero. And it's all very well for governments to say that this is what they want to do, but what they have to be very transparent about is what we are going to have to do in order to bring about that reduction in emissions. And some of the things that have been talked about in the past are things like changing your boiler or changing your car to maybe an electric car or a hydrogen car. And all of that incurs a cost. So the government is examining proposals now at the moment to extend some cash amounts that they might give to households. For example, £4,000 to go to help people replace a boiler. And it is heard that actually it's going to cost a lot more than £4,000 to change your boiler. So some of this money that's being offered is obviously welcome to some extent, but it's not going to meet all the needs of all the people. And it's interesting because this blueprint for cutting carbon from the Treasury has actually been delayed, and it is widely felt that the delay is down to the fact that it's going to reveal that a lot of these costs are going to hit the poorest, the hardest.
Joe, you were saying earlier that, in fact, you had gone down the route of looking to replace your gas boiler. I wonder, has there been polling done? Has there been polling that you've done about public attitudes to changing their behaviour and making the switch away from gas and away from fossil fuels and away from petrol and diesel cars?
Well, people are supportive in principle to a lot of these measures. They're less supportive, for instance, when it comes to eating less meat. But certainly when it comes to changing your boiler, people are supportive, but not if it costs them money. And so people are not against the principle at all. What they're against is having to shell out money for it. And I say this as someone whose only car is a fully electric car. And I think it's great, but it's clearly not for everyone. The infrastructure that's in place in this country country at the moment is really not where it needs to be. And local authorities who should be leading on this tend to be the worst providers of such things in particular areas, not least my own. And so if that is the kind of thing, the kind of change that's going to be required, it's going to take a lot more to convince people, because at the moment they support the idea, but they really can't see themselves taking it. And that's indeed true for Alok Sharma himself, who has said he drives a diesel car, but his next car would be electric, he reckons.
It's always another day, isn't it? No reflection on Alok Sharma there. I think it's partly individual human nature. OK, let's move on. Front page of the Times, big day tomorrow for many teenagers. A-level results come out, and the Times says that A grades will be awarded in almost half of exams. Lucy? Lucy, can you hear me?
Yes, so this is what the Times are saying. A couple of the other papers are actually saying that perhaps that much grade inflation, but almost half of the results for A-levels that are coming out tomorrow are expected to be either at A or even A+. Now, there's some quite interesting details in this, because they've used several actually highlighting how schools will have done in terms of the grade allocation by the teachers that have been given by private schools. And as a result, some people are going to criticise this and saying that, again, it's going to be the private schools that will be seen to have improved the most. But I think another interesting dimension of this is the comment that this is from Barnaby Lennon, who's a former head at Harrow. He chairs the Independent Schools Council, and he's saying that if you've got a situation where your teachers are giving you the grades, they know you best, and this particularly for borderline pupils, perhaps there's a more positive spin that can be put on these pupils' performances, which almost sounds like someone is saying, going forward, maybe we should scrap the whole exam system. And of course, last year we had a ridiculous algorithm situation, which then got completely dismantled. So this is the second year of teachers assessing pupils. But I do wonder what the legacy might be going forward, that if this proves to be at least an effective form of grading and marking pupils, might we be seeing the end of exams?
Interesting. Joe, I suppose, you know, last year's exam season was deemed a fiasco because of the algorithm, and so we have now this year this system of teacher assessment, but the fear is, and it's expressed in the Times by a former Director General at the Department for Education, John Coles, that there isn't a meaningful process of ensuring consistency, and that perhaps is across schools and between this year's results and previous year's results.
Yeah, I mean, the last 2 years have been a disaster, and I really do feel for the students who are receiving their results tomorrow. And there are various problems with the process that those students have gone through, and there are various problems with the exam system as it stands in, if you like, normal times. But I think the particular issue that we have with the system, however you do it at the moment, is if it results in half of all pupils getting, or roughly half of all pupils getting A or A star grades, there's no granulation in there. There's no granularity to decide, well, who are the best students and who are not as strong. And so if moving forward there is going to be something that that looks at things in different ways, whether it's teacher-led assessment or perhaps universities launching their own examinations for entrance exams, then there needs to be a way to differentiate between these pupils, because as a university or as an employer, and I say this as someone who employs graduates, it's very difficult to differentiate between students if everyone that is writing to you, or at least half of those people writing to you, all have A or A stars. And so something needs to be done. It's not fit for purpose at the moment. And that's no criticism of any students who are sitting exams this year, who are getting results this year, but it's not fit for purpose, and something needs to be done moving forward.
OK, well, we shall see in a few hours' time exactly what sort of grades are given out. Lucy, can I take you to the front page of the Daily Mirror? And it has got a story reported by BBC Panorama. Cameron's greed, it says. Tell us more about the details of this.
Yes, David Cameron was reportedly paid or received about £7.2 million from Greensill Capital before it rather spectacularly went bust. This is as a result of papers that have been shown to BBC's Panorama. There's been a programme about that. Half of the money did come from the sale of shares that David Cameron made in 2019, which of course is well before the company did actually collapse. And it does rather highlight how he was probably expected to sing for his supper. We know that he bombarded ministers with requests to be seen or for for meetings to be had, and that left a rather sour taste in the mouth. But obviously, this is what Greensill Capital were expecting him to do. This is why they paid him so much money. This is why they gave him so many share options, and he just exercised those options at a very judicious time.
I should say that Mr. Cameron's spokesman has issued a statement saying that David Cameron did not receive anything like the figures quoted by Panorama. Panorama was quoting, as you say, £7.2 million, but Mr. Cameron's spokesperson doesn't give a figure as to exactly what he did receive. Joe, I want to just briefly, and you may or may not have done work on this, but do stories like this cut through to the general public?
Well, it depends what you mean by cut through. If you mean that do the general public pick up on these stories, then yes, some do, but by no means everyone. But do they actually have a long-lasting impact on voting intention or ultimately who someone will vote for at the ballot box at a general election? No, but the cumulative effect of these stories, all of these stories, can be damaging, and it will be interesting to see whether anything sticks on this.
OK, thank you. Joe, in fact, let me ask you about the front page of the Daily Mail. So COVID tests 5 times the cost of flights.
Yeah, I think that's more of a reflection of how cheap flights are rather than how expensive COVID tests are. The COVID tests are listed as £93, which if you are buying for a family of 4, for instance, obviously adds up. But the flights quoted are only £18, below a picture of a house on fire because of climate change. So I think we really need to have a serious think, not about the price of COVID tests, but moving forward, the price of flights instead.
That's such a good point. Lucy, do you echo that?
Well, I'd love to have been the person who said, right, somebody's got to find me the cheapest flight that's currently on sale. This flight probably goes at like 3 in the morning or something. But I think the point is well made that actually, you know, flights do mean a contribution to climate change. And there couldn't be a more stark contrast on that front page between the discussion about PCR tests, which are in effect a luxury. Nobody is forcing you to go away on holiday. And this devastating photo of the lady in Greece, holiday destination on the island of Evia, whose home is completely destroyed, whose life has really been destroyed. And we need to acknowledge that those two things are linked.
OK. I wonder if I can cover another couple of stories very quickly. Front page of the Yorkshire Post. GPs have suffered a rising toll of abuse, says poll. Joe?
Yeah, I wouldn't. Well, I'd take the poll findings with a pinch of salt because the survey is not a representative sample of doctors. It's just people who went onto the BMA website. But having said that, there clearly is a concern, quite rightly, about the abuse that the doctors are suffering as a result of the COVID crisis and dealing with that in what was obviously hugely stressful circumstances. For it to be made worse by patients' behaviour, I think, is very disappointing.
OK. And ending, Lucy, with the front page of the Daily Star. The headline, Bozo, we will shoot Geronimo.
Oh my goodness, this is a devastating headline. I am very passionate about llamas and alpacas and visgunias, but having spent a lot of time in Peru, but over there they didn't really sentimentalize their attachments to these beautiful animals. So I feel very torn. I would never like to think of a creature being put down or shot needlessly. But the fact is that the tests that have currently been carried out on Geronimo, an alpaca, do suggest that this animal has TB, and that is something that needs to be taken very seriously. We had George Eustace writing yesterday in the newspapers. He comes from a family of farmers, many generations, so he has lived through how painful it is for farmers to lose some of their herd or their flock. In this particular case, I worry that we have allowed ourselves to become too attached to an animal that does, after all, look incredibly endearing. Alpacas and llamas are beautiful creatures. But the bottom line is that if it's unwell, then it probably does need to be put down.
We should think with our heads rather than our hearts. OK, many thanks to both of you, Lucy Beresford and Joe Twyman. Thank you so much. And that is it for the papers. My thanks again to my guests, Lucy and Joe. Sport is next, followed by the latest headlines at midnight. Goodbye for now.